Hey everyone, it's wpgdiorama. So for today I'm just going to be showing you how I did this custom One Punch Man Saitama. So to start off, just because he has a slimmer build, I did go for the Jim Gordon body from McFarlane Toys. And then the rest of the parts I had to 3D print. So the files have been made by Hayden 3D. I had to commission him for that one. And then for the cape, it was done by Rebel 10 Customs. So as you can see for this part here, I am trying to trim the joints to prevent paint rub, or at least to help with it. As you know, McFarlane is not really the best when it comes to paint rubbing. They're not the same as the Marvel Legends where you can just sand it to death. So with this one, just trimming the joints just as much as I can, and then prepping it before I start priming and painting. Alright, so for the next one here, since we're done with the joint prep, I'm just putting on the clips, just preparing it to prime and paint. So for these alligator clips, you can buy a bunch of them from Amazon, like I think 100 pieces for $30 or something like that. But if you're gonna buy one, I would just recommend to buy the wood alligator clips, just because they don't bend if whatever you're clipping it on is heavier. It's not gonna bend like the wired ones that we have here. So yeah, also have some blue tack or the sticky tack handy. They're very useful when putting the clips on the head sculpt. Alright, so for the next part here, I am just applying matte varnish using my airbrush. So for me, instead of sanding, which most people do, I do apply matte varnish instead, so my paint would adhere better. I don't know, it's just less work for me, and it works so far with no issues. It just makes it much easier for me. So for the next part here, I am now applying my primer. So for my primer, I am using the Vallejo surface primer. It comes in different colors. I do use the gray for brighter colors. I use it as an undercoat as compared to the white. I find that for the white primer, I have to use multiple layers for it to look a little better. But with gray, it's a nice opaque color. So even just like one layer is fine with this one. And then for metallics or anything darker, I do use the black primer that they have. Alright, so now that the priming is all done, we're now gonna go to painting the main colors. So for Saitama's costume, I am using the SoFlat by Golden. So I'm using the permanent yellow deep, which is a really nice opaque yellow. So for this one, I like using this because it dries up matte, so it looks really nice afterwards. The only thing with this one is you have to thin it with a paint thinner. So for the paint thinner, I did use the Vallejo paint thinner, airbrush thinner, and it works really well. You just have to kind of mix it up into kind of like a milk consistency so it flows nicely with the airbrush. So the airbrush that I'm using over here is the Iwata HP-CS. So it's like a really good workhorse airbrush. It comes in the 0.35 needle, so it kind of has like a medium spray, kind of like a medium width for the spray. It's really good for general applications of paint, but I would say you'd have to go smaller for shading. So for the next color here for the red, I'm using again SoFlat by Golden. This is the Pyroll Red. And yeah, it's also a very opaque red, as you can see here. Again, I had to use thinner for it. Alright, so we are now into the shading part. So as I mentioned with the sizes of the needle for airbrushes, it's really important, especially it depends on the purpose that you're doing. So now that we're doing shading, you have to have a thinner airbrush needle. So with this one, I am currently using a 0.2, so it's very fine, as you can see there. And then it also requires a much lower PSI. So that's the pressure that's coming from the compressor that's pushing the air out. So it has to be much lower, and you have to be more careful when doing this, because any kind of accidents will cause overspray, which can ruin your initial paint job. So before I do any shading, I apply a clear coat into the base coat that I've done. Just in case I make any accidents, then I can just clean it off with no issues. So for doing the shading here, I'm currently using acrylic inks, and the specific brand that I'm using is the Liquitex brand, which you can usually purchase from the Michaels store if you have some in your area. But yeah, they're fairly cheap. So it's really nice, you don't have to thin it, it's already thin enough to be used in a 0.2 airbrush. So the Iwata HP-CS doesn't have a 0.2 needle, so I am currently using a Harder and Steenbeck Infinity CR airbrush. These ones come in the 0.2 mm's. So yeah, before you do any kind of shading, just make sure that you do practice first. It really takes a lot of skill and a lot of patience and practice before you can achieve that. Because you don't want to ruin your paint job just because you didn't practice doing the shading. But yeah, so this one now I'm just applying extra of the yellow base paint that I use just to blend in the color. Alright, so for this one we are painting the head sculpt. So I'm using the Vallejo premium airbrush paint, specifically the flesh color. And then I do a second coat specifically for Saitama skin color. I'm doing a ratio of 4:1 of the flesh and the dark ochre. And it depends on the skin color of your character, you'd have to add more color and add more paints. Alright, so we are now done with the airbrushing part, so we're now going to be manually brushing all the tiny details that we need to add. So as you can see here, I'm using the new Crydrufi wet palette, and so far I'm very impressed. It has a lot of brush holders, it has a wash station there. It's like an all-in-one modular wet palette, so I like it, it's really nice. So with this one now, if you look at Saitama's design, he does show the skin of his neck area there. So I had to manually paint that part. So I'm just applying the gray base color, so it's easier to match the skin tone as opposed to having a yellow base coat. I think for this part here I tried to paint the skin tone using the airbrush paints that I have, and it didn't end well. As you can see, I'm also using a heat gun, so that's really nice when drying paints. Just be very careful that you don't overdo it, otherwise you're either gonna melt the plastic or you're gonna make the paint crack or boil. So yeah, be very careful with that one. I'd say do like 2 to 3 seconds at a time. So yeah, here's the airbrush paints that I tried using, and it was just very translucent. So here I'm just applying painter's tape to the base, to the chest area there, so I don't have to clean it up later on. So again, as I mentioned, when you're doing multiple layers of something, just make sure to apply clear coats in between paints, just in case you mess up, then it's much easier to clean up. So when cleaning up oversprays or anything like that, I just use a Q-tip and a 70% rubbing alcohol. It works really well. Alright, looks like it's all painted up in this part of the video. There, looks really nice. So now I'm just cleaning up some oversprays. So for this part of the video, I'm just painting the white, this is kind of like the zipper area onto the neck part of his costume. So yeah, painting white on anything is a little harder because white is just not very opaque. So for this one I had to cheat a little bit and use like an off-white kind of gray looking paint. It still looks like white, but it's much more opaque. And then you can just apply at least 2 layers for that one. Alright, so for this one I'm just painting the belt buckle. So again, with anything metallics, I always use a black undercoat, much preferably to have a gloss undercoat. It just makes metallics pop more. There are some instances though that you have to use metallics, you'll have to use a white undercoat. I've seen that with some of the Turbo Dork paints. I think we're mostly done at this part of the video here. So I'm just setting it up so I can put them together. As you can see, once they're all kind of put on together, it's kind of looking more and more like Saitama, so I'm pretty happy with it. So for this one I had to apply glue for the boot area because I did chop off the Jim Gordon legs. Yeah, just so I have a more comic accurate look. Like again, you do lose some articulation, especially to the foot there, but then that's fine with me. So yeah, when putting together the parts, just to prevent any paint rub and just so it's much easier to put them all together, I just use a little bit of heat using a heat gun. It works pretty well for me. Just again, be very careful not to use too much of that one, otherwise it's gonna melt the plastic or it's gonna melt your paint. Alright guys, I think that's mostly it. So here's the final product. Really happy with it. Thanks for checking out the video.